Welcome back to The Lost Legends. I'm Adam Jones, and today we'll be tromping through the legend of the unicorn to see how a few old records and a few mistranslations gave us the myth that we now all know and love. Belief in unicorns goes back as far as human records do, but this animal wasn't always a magical creature. The most interesting part of this legend is seeing how mundane of an animal the unicorn was considered to be for thousands of years. The ancient Greek texts only mention unicorns in science books. No myths, no legends. The medieval scholars had a more difficult time believing in giraffes and sea lions than they did unicorns. Now, some people will tell you that we first got the idea about the unicorn from the Bible, but I think that's a misconception. Let's take a look here. The Bible does mention the word unicorn in the Old Testament, but only in the King James translation from 1604, not the King James translation you can find today. We talked about King James last time, and he's one of those historical characters who pops up all the time like whack-a-mole. Remember, King James wanted to make a Bible that wasn't Catholic. This had been done before, but this was going to be the biggest project to do this, the biggest project to make a non-Catholic Bible, and it still sold every day, so you could say King James was very successful. And in the Old Testament, of the 1604 version of the King James Bible, there is the word unicorn. In passing, it's not a very important moment in the Bible. It doesn't claim that unicorns, as we know them, existed, but it just sort of mentions one, as if it was walking by. But this is not the magical unicorn of legend, just some small animal with a single horn. One horn, unicorn. So it makes sense calling something a unicorn, but when we see that word, we naturally think about the mythical unicorn, and that's not what King James's translators were going for. Remember, until 1604, these passages were not translated as unicorn. So for centuries and centuries, the Old Testament didn't say unicorn. It just happened in 1604. This is the end of the Middle Ages. So this idea that the Bible gave us the idea of a unicorn, well, that's not true. The myth already existed, and it had already changed and gone from being an obscure little animal to a magical creature long before this little translation, which was quickly fixed. Now, unicorns were originally considered to be normal animals, not magical, mythical creatures, but just normal little animals with one horn. And to read about them, you had to go to a bestiary. A bestiary is just a book about animals. It describes animals from all over the world and usually includes elaborate, beautiful drawings. These were very popular, practically the National Geographic of the ancient world. But bestiaries weren't written by world travelers who had actually been to exotic places. They were written by scholars who compiled information from other sources into one big book. Most of the information was passed on to these scholars who couldn't really confirm them. They just put all these together like a good editor. So if you read a bestiary and these are beautiful texts, people still love to open them and go through all the drawings. That'll never get old. But you'll see a unicorn or a dragon right next to an ordinary animal because they were considered to be ordinary animals. You'll also find the rhinoceros showing up in these old bestiaries, and scholars couldn't always decide if these were different animals. Sometimes a bestiary would claim that the rhinoceros and the unicorn were the same. Also, those of you who have seen that name, Pliny, P-L-I-N-Y, on the side of a bottle, now you know the proper pronunciation of Pliny the Elder. Pliny might sound like an obscure character, but his works were referenced throughout the Middle Ages, up until the beginning of modern times, so his opinions were very, very foundational. But there were other influential reports that tell of a one-horned creature nothing like a rhinoceros. The most common description of the unicorn from ancient times that doesn't sound like a rhinoceros describes unicorns as small and goat-like. Now, as you probably know, sometimes goats only grow one horn, or maybe one horn grows a lot longer than the other, and they look like a one-horned creature. And since we see this routine description of the unicorn as a goat with one horn, this is very likely to be the simple explanation for the unicorn as we know it. So at this point, the unicorn doesn't sound very interesting, does it? Just a little horse-like creature with one horn. What about the magic? You may have heard that a unicorn's horn had magic powers, that you could touch the tip of that horn to food or water and it would purify the food or water. And it's true that was a very persistent myth about unicorns. The interesting thing is that animals generally had magic properties back in the old days. I remember coming across a medieval cure for the cold that involved boiling the testicles of a beaver. So while the unicorn's horns supposedly held magic powers, this wasn't very unique since most animals were assumed to have some kind of special power if you knew exactly what to do with exactly which part of the body. Also, it's interesting to note that the unicorn was changing size and shape. Like I said, sometimes people thought it was the rhinoceros and they were just agreeing it was a misunderstanding. But when the unicorn was seen as a separate creature, it might be a little goat, it might be a big huge deer with one horn, it might be long like a greyhound. Lots of different shapes and sizes to the unicorn were going on in the old days. So after seeing the unicorn show up only as a boring animal, you have to wonder when and why it became so popular. And the truth is, nobody knows. Not only did unicorns become more popular and more mythological, but as the Middle Ages went on, the unicorn finally settled into its final physical form. Like I said, previously unicorns had been depicted in various ways, but after a while they began to look like a horse with a horn coming out of its head. This happened around the same time as people began to treat the unicorn as something mystical, something special and supernatural, not just another animal. And like I said, no one's really sure where these trends came from. But I think something that must have had a major impact on how people saw the unicorn is that people began seeing unicorn horns. At least they thought they were. Actual horns, supposedly from unicorns, began showing up. It started, as many things do, with the Vikings. Now, according to lore, the first Viking attack took place in 793. The people of England and South England, they saw a beautiful ship they'd never seen before make its way into the harbor, and they assumed it was there to trade. A local man ran out to greet the ship, but all they got for his trouble was an arrow right in his chest. The ship docked, Vikings poured out and began pillaging the English, who were absolutely unprepared. They were especially unprepared to see the Vikings rob a local monastery. Now, why is that so interesting, robbing a monastery? Europeans used to keep their valuables in monasteries because even criminals were too superstitious to rob a religious building. But the Vikings, back in those days, they held to a different worldview than the rest of Europe, and they saw the monasteries as nothing but a very convenient place to rob. So the Vikings showed up, went straight to the monasteries, and found all the plunder they needed all in one place, only guarded by monks who wouldn't even fight back. These are easy pickings for the Vikings. The Vikings were also master seafarers. They were great sailors, and they would take their boats to places in the world that the rest of Europe might not see, sometimes for centuries. They even took their boats north to the Arctic, and in the Arctic the Vikings mastered the very difficult challenge of hunting the narwhal, the large gray whale from the north, the one with the very long tusk. The Vikings also gave us the name of these things. Narwhal, it comes from the Viking word for corpse. Corpse whale is what they call it. The narwhal often rests near the surface of the water, and its gray body resembles a corpse floating in the water. Hunting a narwhal requires piloting the wooden vessel into Arctic waters, which is not easy, and then killing a whale that usually weighs over a ton. Now, how do you do that? How do you kill an animal that weighs that much and then bring it back home? The way to do this is to wait until the whale takes a breath. If a group of hunters attacks a whale right when it hits the surface, if the whale dies, it will fall all the way, it will sink all the way to the bottom of the ocean. It's too heavy. So, the Vikings realized they had to wait for the whale to take a big breath. And when it was finished taking in that big breath, that's when they would attack. When it was dead, the full lungs of the narwhal would make the creature buoyant enough to float on its own. Then it could be towed back to Scandinavia, assuming it wasn't set upon by sharks along the way. So the Vikings were impressive hunters, impressive raiders, but they were also impressive traders. The 6-foot-long tusk of the narwhal had little value to the Vikings, but they sold for very high prices in the rest of Europe. And in Europe, people saw these and believed they had come from real unicorns, even though the horn might be well over 6 feet long. These horns became one of the biggest status symbols of the Middle Ages. To this day, you can visit the castle of Rosenborg in Copenhagen, Denmark, and see the old throne of Denmark, which was made in the 1600s. This fabulous chair contains 2 narwhal tusks, and at times it was believed that they came from unicorns. They were placed at the throne so royalty could purify their food and drink in case someone was trying to poison them. Did I mention these horns were expensive? The horns of Windsor, for example, is a narwhal tusk with a complicated history. Long story short, it was once owned by Queen Elizabeth I and was so expensive the cost would have paid for an entire castle. Now, why would Elizabeth I keep a supposed unicorn horn around? Why was it valuable? Remember, people called her the Virgin Queen, so it was on brand for her to be seen with the horn of a unicorn, a creature that, by this time, had come to symbolize virginity. Plenty of royal women were suddenly seen pictured with unicorns, and it was usually so they, too, could be associated with virginity. Now, I know this sounds inappropriate today, but in those days, in that culture, virginity was considered to be a virtue, something women should be associated with. Like I said, that sounds inappropriate today, but remember, I'm just the messenger from the Middle Ages. Now, the idea was that a virgin woman could sit under a tree in a forest, you've heard this before, and then a unicorn might come along. This was the only way to hunt a unicorn. Everyone knew this. And once the unicorn came along, it might lay its head down in the virgin woman's lap, and that's when the hunters could jump out of hiding and attack. Almost always with spears. Every time you see it depicted in a painting or a tapestry, it's almost always with spears. That's a common hunting implement, but it also has a little bit of symbolism, as we're going to see. So like I said, lots of old paintings, lots of tapestries show this happening. Unicorns became a very, very popular subject for artists. And what we see is that this unicorn is resting peacefully in the lap of a virgin when a bunch of men with spears show up, and they often pierce the side of the unicorn. Now, why are they piercing the side all the time? It's always the same wound. And it's very obviously the same wound that we see Jesus Christ have on the cross. If you see paintings of the crucifixion, a person named Longinus, a Roman soldier, is stabbing Jesus with his spear right in the side. That word Longinus, it means spear. So we see the unicorn suddenly here being attacked in the same way as Jesus. Meanwhile, a virgin is protesting many, many times. The virgin woman isn't there because she's helping the hunters. She's just as surprised as the unicorn. She's holding up a hand. She's scared. She's saying, no, don't do it. There's all kinds of symbolism here. The very uncomfortable sexual symbolism of a virgin woman asking a bunch of men to stop pointing spears at her, that one speaks for itself, and I think I've said all I want to say about that. But seeing this virgin woman trying to stop the unicorn from being stabbed in the side is obviously sometimes a stand-in for Mary, the Virgin Mary. It's almost as if the medieval painters had painted the Passion of Christ so many times in the same way that they enjoyed having an opportunity to depict this story through the unicorn instead. So you can see for yourself that the unicorn now is no longer being taken seriously as a real animal. It's been relegated to the land of myth. What happened? Like I said, we don't know who invented this idea of the unicorn, but I have an idea of who might have killed the unicorn, who might have stopped the old stories. It's Marco Polo. Marco Polo, as you know, was an Italian man who traveled through Africa and Asia, through places Europeans didn't go and didn't know anything about. And he returned with crazy stories. Some of them are realistic, some of them are wild, but these were very influential stories because people didn't get news from those parts of the world. And Marco Polo's travels, they changed the way people saw the rest of the world. These were published in the year 1300. Now, belief in the unicorn waned significantly when Marco Polo came back from his travels with very sad news. He said the unicorn was not the majestic beast of legend everyone had heard about. Instead, it was a big, fat, mud-dwelling, slobby beast with a stubby horn. This comes as no surprise to those of us who have looked into the legend for ourselves, because we know that Marco Polo was describing a rhinoceros. And he was certain, completely certain, that this was the origin of the unicorn myth, as far as zoology was concerned. And after this report, you start to see people put the unicorn in fewer and fewer scientific books. The unicorn stops showing up in the bestiary, but continues to show up on the tapestry, in paintings. It becomes mythological, it becomes magical, it becomes supernatural. It is no longer a goat with a horn. It leaves that realm and enters the realm of the fantastic for the rest of history. But that doesn't mean people stop believing. And I'm not kidding you, to this day there are people looking for unicorns. There are still people driving slowly through the woods, hoping they might catch a glimpse of one. That's all for today, folks. Don't forget to check out my free book called The Lost Legends. You can find it at author adamjones.com.